Welcome to our online study of the Gospel of John. It's our sincere hope that through these sessions you will gain a greater understanding and appreciation for the genius of the beloved disciple, who is the source of the fourth Gospel. For those of you who are new to these sessions, each video is accompanied by a printable PowerPoint handout, which you can use to take notes or simply follow the presentation. Also, there are discussion questions, which can be used by those in a group setting listening to these sessions, or the discussion questions can be used as jumping-off points for personal reflection and prayer. In this, our first session, we shall introduce you to the fourth Gospel. In particular, we shall highlight the differences between the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then we shall examine the purpose for which John's Gospel was written, followed by a discussion of what we know about the author and the date of the Gospel. Then we shall present an outline of the Gospel in order to show one of the main ways that it differs from the other Gospels. Then we'll speak of two of the key points in Johannine theology, Dualism and Ecclesiology, that is, John's view of the church, as portrayed in his Gospel. Our brief introduction will conclude with a summary history of the community that produced the Gospel of John. This should help understanding of the Gospel as we delve into it further in future sessions. If one reads the Gospel of John, they very soon realize that they're in a somewhat different world from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The similarities of Matthew, Mark, and Luke have led to them being labeled the Synoptic Gospels. John, on the other hand, does not bear much similarity to the Synoptics at all. As a result, scholar John Kaiser chose to name his book on the Gospel of John the Maverick Gospel. Let's look at some of the things that make John a unique gospel in the Scriptures. The first major difference we find is in geography. In the Synoptics, Jesus makes only one visit to Jerusalem, thus dividing the gospel into two parts, a Galilean ministry and a Jerusalem ministry, with a journey of varying length joining them. John's gospel, on the other hand, has Jesus moving constantly between Galilee and Jerusalem. He makes a total of 5 visits to Jerusalem in John, including the final fateful one leading to the Passion. The Synoptic Gospels imply that John the Baptist prepared the way of Jesus, and when Jesus arrives for his ministry, John falls to the background. In fact, Luke has him arrested and in prison when Jesus begins his ministry. John's Gospel, on the other hand, has John and Jesus working together, as is evidenced by John 3:24. John had not yet been put into prison. The incident where Jesus throws the buyers and sellers out of the temple occurs at the end of the Synoptic Gospels, which would be in line with the Jerusalem ministry at the end. That incident appears at the beginning of the Gospel of John in chapter 2. This demonstrates that John in his Gospel presumes much of what has been narrated in the Synoptics and uses his Gospel to go further in developing his picture of Jesus. One of the most striking differences is that the theology of the Eucharist, which is presented in the Last Supper in the Synoptic Gospels, is present as a discourse following the miracle of the multiplication of loaves and fish in John 6. There's no mention of an institution of the Eucharist in the Johannine Last Supper. There's also a discrepancy between John and the Synoptics regarding the date of the Last Supper, and correspondingly whether it was a Passover meal. Clearly, in the Synoptics, the Last Supper is a Passover meal. Jesus specifically tells his disciples to ask a householder that they will encounter, "Where is the guest room where I am to eat the Passover with my disciples?" The ritual that is described in the Synoptic Last Supper narrative is clearly the Passover Haggadah, that is, ritual. John, on the other hand, has a note in the Passion narrative as he introduces the trial before Pilate. They, the Jewish leaders themselves, did not enter the praetorium, the palace of Pilate, so that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Thus, the Synoptics show the Last Supper as a Passover meal eaten before Jesus is arrested, while John notes that the Passover will begin on the evening of the crucifixion, a day later. The crucifixion, therefore, in the Synoptics takes place on the 15th day of Nisan, the first day of Passover, whereas in John it takes place on the 14th day of Nisan, the day before. What's going on in such a divergence? According to John, the crucifixion takes place at the time that the lambs are being sacrificed for Passover. John's Gospel, as we shall see, will introduce Jesus as the Lamb of God in 129. Thus, John wants to show that as the lambs are being sacrificed for the Passover meal, so also the Lamb of God is being sacrificed to take away the sins of the world. Having looked at the differences in John's Gospel versus the Synoptics, let's now turn to the purpose for which he wrote. As the text of the Gospel is coming to an end in chapter 20, verse 31, the author gives his purpose. "But these things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." There is thus a double purpose. First, to inspire belief that the person Jesus who walked the earth is really and truly the Christ, the expected one, the Messiah. And not only that he is the Son of God. It wanted to show that as the church will later define Jesus as being truly God and truly human, people in the early days of the church had no problem accepting that Jesus was a human being. But they did hesitate at the fact that he was God. John writes to bolster this belief. Secondly, this belief will lead the believer to having eternal life in the name of Jesus. So John writes to show that belief leads to eternal life. As with all of the Gospels, the question of authorship is a rather problematic one. The question of authorship of John's Gospel is no less challenging. Let's look at what the scholars say on that subject. We first turn to the earliest evidence found in the writings of the Fathers of the Church. Two of the earliest witnesses to the Gospel of John are the Bishop of Hierapolis in the early 2nd century, Papias, and the Muratorian Canon, perhaps the oldest list of books in the New Testament, dating from around 170 AD. Papias writes, "I would inquire about the presbyters' discourses, what was said by Andrew or Peter or by Philip or by Thomas or James or by John or Matthew, or by another of the Lord's disciples, and what Ariston and the presbyter John, the disciples of the Lord, say." The first John mentioned is more than likely John, the son of Zebedee, since he's mentioned with Matthew, both of whom were members of the 12. This John is accepted by most as the origin of the Gospel of John. The second John, the presbyter, is more than likely the source of the Johannine epistles. The Muratorian canon, later in the century, is more specific, containing a recollection of how the fourth gospel came about. The fourth gospel is by John, one of the disciples. When his fellow disciples and bishops were urging him, he said, "Fast with me for 3 days, beginning today, and whatever will have been revealed to us, let us recount it with each other." On that very night, it was revealed to the apostle Andrew that all of the things that they had recalled to mind, John should write them all in his own name. Later in the 2nd century, we have the testimony of Irenaeus of Lyon, the great apologist who developed the first systematic theology of the Church. His great work, known as Adversus Haereses, or Against Heresies, is a 5-book work defending the developing Christian theology against the onslaught of the Gnostic Docetists. In the 3rd chapter of the 3rd book of that great work, we have 2 reminiscences that identify the author of the fourth gospel as John. In Adversus Haereses, Book 3, Chapter 3, line 1, Irenaeus recalls, "Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia." This recollection adds the fact that John traveled to Ephesus, and there he produced the gospel. Then, a few lines later, in Book 3, Chapter 3, line 4, Irenaeus writes, "Then again, the church in Ephesus founded by Paul, and having John, remaining among them permanently until the time of Trajan, is a true witness of the tradition of the apostles." This fragment further confirms the presence of John in Ephesus. Here we have a map of the Eastern Mediterranean world at the time of Paul and John. The events of Jesus' life took place below the lower right-hand corner of the map, in Israel. If you look toward the left center on the Aegean Sea, you can see Ephesus. Tradition has it that the Apostle John traveled from Jerusalem to Ephesus, quite a lengthy trip. During the time of the Emperor Domitian, he was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he had a revelation that became the book of Revelation. After his release under Nerva, he returned to Ephesus, where he remained and ultimately where he died. Today, when one visits Ephesus, there is a site that commemorates the presence of John in that city. Here we have the grand entrance to the compound of the Basilica of St. John. Inside the compound are the remains of the basilica, thought to have been constructed by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. According to some, it was modeled on the Church of the Apostles in Constantinople. The columns on 2 levels stand out as one enters the remains. Here, in the center of the basilica, is the tomb of St. John, surrounded by 4 columns, which may have held a baldacchino. It's marked by a marble stone inscribed, "The Tomb of St. John." Finally, there's another tradition connected with St. John traveling to Ephesus. At the cross in John's Gospel, Jesus gave the care of his mother to the beloved disciple, John. Thus, it's supposed that when John traveled to Ephesus, she traveled with him also. Here, we have a picture of the house of the Virgin atop a rather high hill, Mount Coressos. Pilgrims believe that Mary was taken here by St. John and lived here until her Assumption. Having looked at the patristic evidence and the evidence in Ephesus, let's look at what the gospel itself might say about its origin. Based on John 21:24, which says, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true." It is generally thought that the gospel has its origin with the beloved disciple, mentioned several times in the second half of the gospel. The text of the gospel carefully separates the beloved disciple from others in the narrative. Thus, the gospel tells us who the beloved disciple is not, for example, those whom he appears with, but never definitely identifies who he is. The best solution is to say that the gospel's traditions go back to one known as the beloved disciple, and these traditions were at some point put in writing by members of a community gathered around this beloved disciple, and eventually one member of the community edited them into what is the gospel we have today. The next question of interest is, when did the Gospel of John come about? Based on the evidence above that John builds on the theology of the Synoptics, it would be sensible to presume that John is later, thus at the end of the 1st century. There are 3 factors that enter into this discussion. The first is from manuscript evidence. An early papyrus copy of a fragment of the Gospel of John, containing John 18:31-33 and 37-38, is currently in the John Rylands Library of Oxford University. The date of this papyrus suggests a date in the late 1st or early 2nd century. Second, John 9:22 contains a reference to what is known as the Birkat HaManim, the blessing of heretics, introduced by the rabbis at Jamnia after the fall of the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. This blessing of or against heretics was introduced to purposely root out those who claimed to be followers of Jesus from the synagogue. Again, the date of this is late 1st century. We'll also have more to say on the Birkat HaManim when we talk about the history of the community. Third, the influence of the Synoptics mentioned above. If indeed John knew Mark and Luke, it would make the date of writing in his gospel late 1st century. If that thesis fails, then the date could be relatively earlier. However, most don't see that. So then, the best solution of the date is that John's gospel appeared around 90 CE. Next is the question of structure or outline of the 4th gospel. We present the structure of the gospel so that you can see how the various parts fit together when we begin to look at the gospel in detail. Also, it's good to spend some time on the structure of John, since this gospel is so radically different from the others. John's gospel can be simply divided into 4 parts, which are not all of equivalent length. Unlike Matthew and Luke, who begin their gospel with an account of the infancy of Jesus, or Mark, who launches immediately into the ministry of Jesus, John chooses to begin his work with a prologue, which is a poetic introduction to the gospel, speaking of the Word in pre-existence, in creation, before the incarnation, and the Word incarnate. This sets the tone for the book of signs. This section is the guts of the ministry of Jesus in Galilee and Jerusalem. It's called the book of signs because narrated in it are 7 miraculous acts of Jesus known as signs. Following the book of signs, John moves immediately to the Last Supper with a rather long discourse, the end of chapter 13 through the end of chapter 17. Then comes the Johannine narrative of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. This total section is known as the Book of Glory. The final section is an addition to the original gospel, which speaks of the relation of the beloved disciple to Peter, and what's to be done when the beloved disciple dies. This is generally referred to as the epilogue. As you can see in the Gospel of John, nearly half the gospel treats the final days of Jesus' life. Let's delve a little more deeply into the Book of Signs. As I said, it mainly comprises narratives of 7 miraculous acts of Jesus. The first is the changing of water into wine at Cana in Galilee. This is unique to John. That's followed by the cure of the official son at Cana. This has parallels in the Synoptics, but the locale is different. Next is the cure of the paralytic at the pools of Bethzatha, which is followed by an explanatory discourse. This can be seen to parallel the cure of the paralytic in chapter 2 of Mark. The central sign is one which appears in all of the Synoptics, twice in Matthew and twice in Mark, the multiplication of loaves. This sets the scene for the great bread of life discourse in John. The fifth also appears in the Synoptics following the multiplication, the walking on water. The sixth is the cure of the blind man in Jerusalem. This has parallels in the Synoptics as far as the miracle narrative is concerned. But again, the ensuing expansion is totally Johannine. Finally, the story of the raising of Lazarus, which again is unique to John. All these are referred to as signs because they, in some way or other, point to the ultimate sign of John's gospel, the cross and resurrection. The Book of Glory begins with the Johannine narrative of the Last Supper, with the washing of feet found only in John. This is followed by the great last discourse of the gospel, comprising a little over 4 chapters, as we saw above. Following the final discourse, Jesus and his disciples traveled to the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Passion narrative begins, culminating in the burial of Jesus. The Book of Glory ends with the narratives of the resurrection and the appearances of the risen Lord. Now let's spend a few moments looking at some theological points in the fourth gospel. As the structure is quite different from the Synoptics, so also is the theology more developed than the Synoptics. One word that can describe the theology of the fourth gospel is dualistic, or dualism. Many would see this dualistic tendency deriving from the fact that the gospel seems to emanate from a polemical situation. It expresses an us-them mentality. Hence, that has been, in the theology of the gospel, drawn out into a number of symbolic opposites. The most significant is light-darkness. It's key in the prologue and lurks behind many of the units in the gospel text. Next, we find life-death. Living in the light leads to life. Living in darkness leads to death. Implied in that is the dualism of God-Satan and the dualism of above and below. God comes from the realm above, Satan from the realm below. These are then specified in the next dualism, heaven-earth. When talking about the human being, this dualism is seen more in the contrast of spirit and flesh. Spirit is heavenly from above. Flesh is earthly from below. This leads naturally to the next dualism, truth-falsehood. And the true Israel, that is, the followers of Jesus, versus the Jews, who refuse to follow Jesus. Ultimately, all these dualisms boil down to belief and unbelief. This dualism appears horizontally between this world and the world to come in time, and vertically between our home on this earth and our true home in heaven. Our other theological notion is ecclesiology, which is a fancy theological term for the understanding of church. Contra to the Synoptics, we find no church organization in the fourth gospel. It presents rather a community of believers who follow Jesus based on the preaching of the beloved disciple, who presents a community led by the Spirit and bound together in love. As we shall see in our discussion of the history of the community, that can be a good thing, but it also can be problematic. One of the key notions found in the gospel is that of the relation of Jesus to the Father. And that relation of Jesus to the Father is mirrored in the relation of Jesus to the believers. For example, Jesus says, "As the Father has loved me, so also do I love you." You can substitute any number of verbs for love in that sentence, and the sentence remains still valid. This will be demonstrated more clearly as we follow through in the gospel text. Finally, the gospel exhibits ecclesial sectarianism. As we shall see, this community came into existence because they had a common experience of being expelled from the synagogue. This naturally led to their reliance on the Spirit, but also contributed to their us-them attitude, as they defined themselves in relation to the synagogue who expelled them. As I said before, this would account for much of the dualism that we find in the gospel. Let's flesh out our introduction with a look at this community that produced the gospel and its development. Much of what I'm going to present here is based on the thesis of Reverend Raymond E. Brown, presented in his book, The Community of the Beloved Disciple. The development of the Johannine community can be divided into 4 stages, delineated by the community's writings. First, the period before the gospel was written, that is, the 50s to the 80s of the first century. Second, the time of the writing of the gospel, namely the 90s of the first century. Third, the period of the writing of the epistles, around the year 100, and finally, the period after the epistles, the early 2nd century. In the pre-gospel era, very early on, a split between Judaism and Christianity was evident. From the Christian side, this was seen in the decisions of the Council of Jerusalem, which allowed Gentile converts to enter the church with no demand that they follow Jewish ways or the Jewish law. From the Jewish side, it was seen in a move of the rabbis to expel those who believed in Jesus from the synagogue. It's supposed by Brown that the early Johannine community was a group of these expelled Christians who rallied around the beloved disciple and learned of Jesus through him. After the destruction of Jerusalem in the year CE 70, the center of Judaism moved north from Jerusalem to the coastal town of Jamnia or Yavne. This center was dominantly Pharisaic, as the Pharisees were the only major sect of Judaism to survive the destruction. It was these Pharisaic rabbis who made the institution of synagogue the mainstay of post-fall Judaism. Two of the major names of the day were Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Gamaliel II. They were, among others, responsible for the shape of Pharisaic Judaism and ultimately what we call today Rabbinic Judaism. This expulsion was accomplished through the reformulation of one of the 18 benedictions of the Shemoneh Esrei, prayed in the synagogue service after the rabbi had expounded on the readings. In particular, as we read in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Berakoth 28b to 29a, Rabbi Gamaliel asked whether there was anyone who could compose a benediction against the Menim, or the heretics. Samuel Hakatan, the small, stood up and composed the curse on the Menim. It was as follows: For the apostates let there be no hope, and let the arrogant government be speedily uprooted in our days. Let the Nosrim, the Nazarenes, or the Christians, and the Menim, the heretics, be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life and not inscribed together with the righteous. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who humblest the proud. Now, that's a blessing. I sometimes think with blessings like that one, who needs curses? As the gospel traditions were being formulated, there began to be controversies between the future Johannine Christians and the synagogue leaders, and in particular, those controversies were about the person and nature of Jesus. After the 12th benediction was reformulated to specifically include Christians among the Menim, or the heretics, a person suspected of being a min, a heretic, would be invited to lead the benedictions, and all would watch to see what he would do at the 12th. If he prayed it, he called the curse upon himself. If he refused, he was expelled from the synagogue. Thus the group which became the Johannine community was constituted. Thus the earliest Johannine Christians were Jewish. But early on, they were joined by another group of Jewish Christians who held anti-temple views, similar to the Hellenists of Acts, and a group of Samaritan converts. This might account for the placement of the temple incident in John's Gospel and the inclusion of the encounter with the woman of Samaria in chapter 4, which is found only in the Gospel of John. As the community developed, traditions from the beloved disciple about Jesus were collected and gradually molded into narratives. Eventually, these narratives were joined to produce an early version of the gospel. A key theme of this gospel was to show that Jesus of Nazareth, who walked the earth, was indeed the Son of God, God incarnate. This was to counter the objections of the Jews that such a belief was blasphemous. God, who had existed from before the beginning, in the minds of the Johannine Christians, had become one of us. Nevertheless, difficulties continued with the Jews, who moved beyond expulsion to outright persecution, killing Christians, feeling that they were acting in the name of God. But also, the high Christological position of the Johannine community led to difficulties with other Christians. This was coupled with the charismatic nature of the Johannine community versus the more institutional hierarchical nature of the Pauline or Synoptic churches. The Johannine community saw them as, quote, the other sheep, not of this fold, spoken of in the parable of the Good Shepherd. The reliance upon the direction of the Spirit and the corresponding charismatic nature of the community ultimately led to division. When the Spirit's promptings were seen by members of the community in diametrically opposite ways, division ensued quickly. Struggles emerged in the community between groups that saw various aspects of the gospel differently. In particular, there were disputes over who Jesus was, Christology, how one should act, ethics. The gospel, in fact, gave only one ethical command: to love one another as I have loved you. There were disputes over the final days, namely eschatology, and the very nature of the Spirit, pneumatology. The Johannine Epistles sought to preserve the unity of the community against many who sought to depart because their views were not being accepted. As a result, the author of the first letter of John feels that it's the last hour. One example: the gospel had done its job of showing that the Jesus who walked the earth was God so well that by the time of the epistles that was not a problem. Now, people had difficulties seeing that God had become in Jesus a real, complete, total human being. Many in the community taught that he only seemed to be human. The author of the epistles tries to counter this opinion. However, he seems to be in the minority, as those who wish to leave the community, the secessionists, seem to have larger numbers. As we move to the 2nd century, the secessionists remove themselves from the Johannine community toward a number of developing heretical sects. The Docetists, who claimed that Jesus only seemed to be human. The Gnostics, who saw salvation in secret knowledge imparted to some, not all. Also, many joined the Montanists, who saw the role of the Spirit in a manner similar to the Pentecostals or the Charismatics of today. Eventually, those left the author of the letters and those left with the author of the letters discovered that if they were to survive and not split into oblivion, they needed to join the greater church, the churches of the Synoptics and Paul. In that, they brought to those churches their higher Christology and adopted from those churches their hierarchical institutional Ecclesiology. Well, that's about all for the introductory material. It's our hope that as we go through the gospel, these introductory points will enlighten the gospel for you, and the deeper study of the gospel will make clearer these points. So, see you next time for the prologue of John's gospel.